Our last session is on individualism, bringing the gospel to a table. The concept of the autonomous self was a seed planted in the soil of the Enlightenment that eventually came into full fruition in the 20th century. Evangelistic approaches then were often geared to offer salvation as largely an individual and very personal decision. Darrell Guter notes that this made salvation a private event by dividing my personal salvation from the advent of God's healing reign all over the world. Evangelists then focused on merely individual decisions and personal faith journeys. Postmoderns, however, are yearning for community since they want to be reassured in a fragmenting world that the society they belong to, there's a family, according to John Stott. The irony of living in a hyper-individual world is that this creates a yearning for belonging in a community where everyone knows your name. This yearning for community now offers 21st century evangelists an opportunity to express their faith through hospitality that is offered in small groups. It's no secret that Westerners value their privacy. In fact, Western culture is one of the most hyper-individual cultures that we know of. The unintended consequence of this high regard for privacy, though, is loneliness, resulting from a lack of community. Leonard Sweet notes, "The paradox is this: the pursuit of individualism has led to this place of hunger for connectedness, for communities, not of blood or nation, but communities of choice." The church in North America faces the challenge from millennials that is a generation that yearns for diversity and community. It's this yearning that provides an opportunity for the church to practice hospitality. During the earlier class sessions, students should be reminded that they will be given an opportunity to invite guests to share a meal and to share their stories as a way to practice evangelism during the last week of class. This class will practice hospitality together over a meal to demonstrate how Bruce Molina describes hospitality in this way. It's the process by means of which an outsider's status is changed from a stranger to a guest, and the outsider is received and socially transformed from stranger to guest. Hospitality then differs from entertaining friends and family. Hospitality provides a concrete expression of love and faith. Christine Pohl simply puts it, "The tradition of hospitality challenges us to see people not as embodied needs, but as persons with stories and gifts. At the center of hospitality are consistent efforts to make neighborly love more expansive and respond to strangers more personally." Thus, hospitality calls for collectivism, community, and inclusivity in one's personal life. Remember, Jesus hosted and fed people, such as in Luke 9, Mark 8, just to name a few. Robert Kelly Jr. writes on what is meant in biblical times to share or invite someone for a table fellowship. He says, "In the various cultures underlying the New Testament, dining with someone indicated solidarity with that person. To eat with is to identify with. To take another meal with someone was to offer that individual the right hand of fellowship in the deepest sense of the term." In the learning activity for this week, we're going to ask students to practice biblical hospitality by inviting a guest who is not yet a believer for a meal in the classroom. During previous research sessions, you've reminded students that we will have a meal with invited guests. By asking these students to invite people to come to the last class to share a meal and share their stories, this alone may alert students to the fact that they need to nurture relationships with unchurched or de-churched people, because it's very difficult to approach a total stranger and invite them for a meal. So students should be reminded about the previous session on identity. For example, students should consider the networks that they already have at their places of work and of play and of social media in order to cross these bridges of God and invite someone to this non-threatening meal. In the past, students would invite people such as an agnostic, atheist, one was a Satanist, a Muslim, etc. Students that succeed in inviting others often encourage other students to do likewise. So once these guests come, during the mealtime, the invited student introduces their friend to the class and they encourage students to ask inviting questions in order to listen and learn more from this guest's story. Encourage the students to utilize the lessons that they've learned in previous sessions and to put them into practice, such as the value of narratives, multi-worldviews, of pinstripe, digital learning, etc. Christine Pohl notes that hospitality has a particular attractiveness since it has a subversive and remedial dimension and allows practitioners to resist destructive cultural patterns. When the larger society tends to disregard or dishonor certain persons, small acts of respect and hospitality are powerful alternative statements. After the meal and discussions, publicly thank the guests for sharing this meal with them and say farewells. Encourage students to follow up with their guests later, and then ask the class to reflect on what they had learned from the guest. They could ask questions like this: did they feel more confident and competent to engage this person authentically? How did the person respond? What went well and what went not so well? What may you do differently next time for hospitality? Who else could you express hospitality to in order to share community and overcome this penchant for individualism? How can you follow up with people? In previous sessions with students, the guest and student exchanged phone numbers. Sometimes it resulted in the guest actually coming to church on the next Sunday. In the past, both the invited guests and the students had a very positive interpersonal experience, resulting in strong faith-sharing encounters. To conclude this session, people like to be respected and feel at ease when they're invited to belong before believing. This belonging before believing offers people time to make their decision without pressure from the witness. Hospitality is extending a hand of welcome to belong, to form relationships without handing a tract or preaching at someone. When people feel welcomed, they can identify themselves with the group to such a time that they can then become one of them, and belief comes along the way. Since conversion is a complex process that takes many different turns and is unique with every individual, people require space and time to experience or have an encounter with God. Some will have an encounter like Saul on the Damascus Road, where it was very instant, while others may have an Emmaus Road experience where Jesus is identified during a meal. The hope is that they will meet Christ through the practice of hospitality to address their deep longing for community.